On the 5th of January 1066, King Edward of England died in his palace at Westminster. His death marks the end of a reign that had lasted for 24 years, a period characterized by relative peace, but also by a deepening political fracture within the English court. Edward, known to history as the Confessor due to his piety, had spent his final years focused on the construction of St. Peter's Abbey, which we now know as Westminster Abbey. While he succeeded in completing the church, he failed in the primary duty of a medieval monarch. He died without children. The lack of a direct heir created an immediate power vacuum. In 11th century England, the succession was not purely hereditary. While being of royal blood was preferred, the ultimate decision rested with the Witan, a council of high-ranking nobles and religious leaders who had the authority to choose the king. As Edward lay dying, the Witan faced a difficult choice, as there were three distinct men who looked toward the English crown with ambition. The first was already in the room. Harald Godwinson was the Earl of Wessex and the brother-in-law of the dying king. He was the wealthiest and most powerful man in England, effectively running the government during Edward's decline. He had the support of the nobility and a reputation as a capable military commander. To the English council, he represented stability and continuity. Across the English Channel, William, the Duke of Normandy, watched the events in London closely. William was a cousin of King Edward and claimed that the late king had promised him the throne years earlier. He controlled a powerful, militarized duchy in northern France and believed his claim was supported not just by blood, but by divine right. Far to the north, a third claimant waited. Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, based his claim on a complex treaty made between previous kings of England and Norway. Hardrada was a legendary warrior who had spent decades fighting across Europe and the Middle East. He viewed England as a prize to be won through force. The conflict that followed Edward's death would not be a simple dispute over a title. It triggered a chain of events that resulted in two massive seaborne invasions and two of the bloodiest battles in medieval history, fought less than 3 weeks apart. The outcome of these struggles would lead to the destruction of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and the imposition of a new ruling class, a new language, and a new social order. Part 1. The Wealthy Earl, Harald Godwinson. Harald Godwinson was not born into royalty, but by the time he reached his 40s, he was the undisputed master of England in all but name. His father, Godwin, had risen from obscurity to become the Earl of Wessex under King Canute, the Danish king who conquered England earlier in the century. Through shrewd political maneuvering and aggressive land acquisition, Godwin secured earldoms for his sons and married his daughter Edith to King Edward the Confessor. By the 1050s, the Godwins were arguably wealthier than the king himself, controlling vast estates that stretched across the richest southern counties of England. Harold succeeded his father as the Earl of Wessex in 1053. While his father had been a blunt instrument of political force, often clashing directly with the king, Harold proved to be a more subtle and diplomatic operator. For the 13 years leading up to the conquest, Harold acted as the right hand of the king. The contemporary sources often refer to him as the sub-regulus, or under-king. Edward the Confessor, increasingly focused on his religious devotions and the construction of his abbey, largely delegated the governance of the realm to Harold. This period allowed Harold to build a network of loyalty among the English thegns and bishops that would prove crucial later on. His capability was not limited to administration. Harald Godwinson was a seasoned general, and his military reputation was built on the rough, mountainous terrain of Wales. In 1055 and again in 1063, Harold led campaigns against Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, the only Welsh ruler to ever unite all of Wales under a single banner. The campaign of 1063 is particularly notable because it demonstrated Harold's tactical adaptability. The English armies were accustomed to fighting in a shield wall formation, wearing heavy mail armor that provided excellent protection but limited mobility. Harold recognized that this traditional equipment was useless against the Welsh, who fought using hit-and-run tactics in their native hills and valleys. Harold reorganized his forces. He equipped his soldiers with lighter leather armor and javelins, allowing them to pursue the Welsh into the mountains. He coordinated a two-pronged assault, leading a fleet of ships along the coast, while his brother Tostig led a cavalry force from the north. The campaign was a total success. The Welsh were driven to exhaustion, and Gruffydd was eventually killed by his own men, who sent his head to Harold as a peace offering. This victory secured the western border of England and proved that Harold could command large-scale, complex military operations. However, the defining moment of Harold's life and the incident that would doom the Anglo-Saxon kingdom occurred across the Channel in Normandy. In 1064, or possibly 1065, Harald Godwinson travelled to France. The precise motivation for this journey remains one of the great mysteries of the era. Norman sources written after the Conquest claim that King Edward sent Harold specifically to confirm William of Normandy as his heir. English sources, which are more fragmented, suggest Harold may have been travelling to negotiate the release of his brother and nephew, who were being held as hostages in Normandy, or that he was simply on a fishing or hunting trip that went wrong due to a storm. Regardless of the intent, the result is well documented. Harold's ship was blown off course and landed in the county of Ponthieu, a region bordering Normandy. The local ruler, Count Guy, followed the custom of the time which viewed shipwrecked travellers as opportunities for ransom. He seized Harold and his crew and threw them into a dungeon. When word reached William of Normandy that the most powerful earl in England was being held prisoner by his neighbour, William demanded Harold's release. Count Guy complied, and Harold was transferred into William's custody. What followed was a period of enforced hospitality. Harold was treated as an honoured guest, but he was effectively a prisoner who could not leave without the Duke's permission. To maintain the appearance of an alliance, William invited Harold to join him on a military campaign into Brittany. The Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-metre-long embroidery commissioned by the Normans to tell their version of the story, depicts this campaign in detail. It shows Harold and William riding together and eating together. In one famous scene, Harold is shown saving two Norman soldiers from quicksand near the river Cousnal, physically hauling them to safety. At the end of the campaign, William knighted Harold, giving him weapons and armour. In the feudal world, receiving arms from another man was a symbolic act of submission, marking the receiver as the subordinate of the giver. Then came the oath. According to Norman accounts, the two men travelled to the town of Bayeux, or perhaps Bonneville. William sat on a throne, and Harold was made to stand before two altars covered in cloth. William asked Harold to swear an oath to support William's claim to the English throne upon the death of Edward the Confessor. Harold, surrounded by Norman soldiers and far from home, swore the oath. The Norman chroniclers add a dramatic flourish to this event. They claim that after Harold swore, William removed the cloths from the altars to reveal that they concealed the holy relics of saints, bones, and other sacred objects. In the medieval mind, swearing on relics was a binding contract with God. Breaking such an oath was a mortal sin that imperiled one's soul. Harold returned to England shortly after, but the damage was done. To the Normans, Harold was now William's man. Upon his return to England, Harold faced a domestic crisis that would fracture his own family. In 1065, the northern earldom of Northumbria rose up in rebellion against their earl, Tostig Godwinson, Harold's brother. Tostig had ruled the north with a heavy hand, imposing high taxes and utilizing brutal enforcement methods that alienated the local nobility. The rebels marched south, demanding Tostig's removal and threatening civil war if he remained in power. King Edward asked Harold to resolve the situation. Harold faced an impossible choice. He could support his brother, using the royal army to crush the rebellion, but this would likely plunge England into a civil war at a time when the king was dying and foreign enemies were watching. Alternatively, he could sacrifice his brother to maintain the peace and unity of the kingdom. Harold chose the kingdom. He met with the rebels and agreed to their demands. Tostig was stripped of his title, declared an outlaw, and exiled from England. Tostig never forgave Harold. He fled England, consumed by rage and a desire for revenge, believing that Harold had conspired against him to secure his own path to the throne. This rift within the House of Godwin removed a key ally from the north of England and created a dangerous enemy who would scour the courts of Europe looking for anyone willing to invade England. On the 5th of January, 1066, King Edward died. The Vita Edwardi Regis, a contemporary text, describes the scene on the king's deathbed. It states that in his final moments, Edward extended his hand toward Harold and entrusted him with the protection of the Queen and the kingdom. To the English Witan, this deathbed bequest superseded any previous promises made to William years earlier. The council acted with unprecedented speed. The very next day, the 6th of January, the Witan elected Harald Godwinson as king. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey on the same day as Edward's funeral. This haste suggests that the English nobility knew the storm was coming. They needed an established warrior king, a man who had defeated the Welsh and governed the realm, not a distant duke or a foreign king. Harold took the throne as Harald II. He was an experienced ruler, 44 years old, tall, and physically imposing. He began his reign by fortifying the southern coast. He minted coins with his likeness, bearing the inscription Pax, meaning peace, but he knew peace was unlikely. He was fully aware of the oath he had sworn in Normandy. He argued that the oath was invalid, because it was made under duress. A prisoner cannot freely enter into a contract. Furthermore, he argued that the English crown was not a piece of property that could be promised by a king or an earl. It was a position granted by the Witan. However, the political reality in Europe was shifting against him. William of Normandy launched a diplomatic offensive, sending envoys to Rome to plead his case before the Pope. He argued that Harold was a perjurer and a usurper. The Pope, swayed by William's arguments and perhaps seeing an opportunity to bring the English Church closer to Rome, gave his blessing to William's invasion. He sent William a papal banner to carry into battle. This transformed a territorial dispute into a holy war. Harold was now a man marked by the Church, yet, as the spring of 1066 turned to summer, Harold's immediate concern was the logistical defense of his kingdom. He called out the Fyrd, the militia of free men, and stationed them along the southern coast. He gathered a massive fleet off the Isle of Wight. He waited for William throughout the summer months, scanning the horizon for the Norman sails. But the attack, when it finally came, did not come from the south. It came from the family member Harold had exiled. Tostig Godwinson had been busy. After failing to find support in Flanders and Normandy, Tostig had sailed north to Norway. There, he found a receptive audience in a king who had spent his entire life seeking war. Tostig told Harald Hardrada that England was divided and weak, and that Harald Godwinson was a usurper with little support. It was a lie, but it was enough to launch the invasion fleet that would force the new King of England to turn his back on the English Channel and march north. Part 2. The Bastard Duke, William of Normandy. While Harald Godwinson was securing his borders in Wales and managing the English court, the man who would become his nemesis was forging a very different kind of power across the Channel. William of Normandy was a man shaped by a childhood of extreme violence and insecurity. If Harold's life was defined by the accumulation of political influence, William's life was defined by the brutal struggle for survival. William was born in either 1027 or 1028 in the town of Falaise. His father was Robert I, the Duke of Normandy, a man with a fearsome reputation. However, William's vulnerability stemmed from his mother, Helena. She was not married to the Duke. She was a local woman, the daughter of a tanner or an embalmer. In the rigid social hierarchy of the 11th century, this heritage was a stain that William could never fully wash away. Throughout his life, his enemies would mock him with the scent of tanning fluids and animal hides. To his contemporaries, he was not known as William the Conqueror. He was William the Bastard. In 1035, Duke Robert decided to undertake a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Before he left, he gathered his barons and forced them to swear fealty to his illegitimate son, who was then only 7 or 8 years old. Robert died on his return journey in Nicaea, leaving the young William as the Duke of Normandy. The death of the father signaled the beginning of a chaotic period known as the Minority. For the next 12 years, Normandy collapsed into anarchy. The Norman barons, fierce and independent men descended from Vikings who had settled the region a century earlier, saw the child duke as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. They built illegal castles, waged private wars, and murdered one another for control of the boy. William grew up watching his guardians die. One of his stewards, Osborne, was having his throat cut while sleeping in the same room as the young duke. His tutor was killed. His uncle was killed. At times, his maternal uncle had to hide the boy in the cottages of poor villagers to protect him from assassination squads sent by rival noble families. This childhood trauma forged William's adult personality. He grew into a man who trusted almost no one, who was constantly vigilant, and who understood that in his world, mercy was often seen as weakness. By 1047, William was around 20 years old and determined to take control of his duchy. The barons of western Normandy formed a coalition to depose him, led by his own cousin. William was forced to flee his hunting lodge in the middle of the night to escape capture. He rode straight to the court of King Henry I of France. Although the French king had often been an enemy of Normandy, he feared the chaos of the barons more than he feared the young duke. King Henry agreed to provide an army to support William. The resulting conflict culminated in the Battle of Val es Dunes. It was the first time William led men into a large-scale engagement. The young duke fought in the front lines, reportedly killing one of the rebel leaders in single combat. The victory was total. The rebel coalition was shattered, and William began the long process of bringing the unruly barons to heel. The William that emerged from this civil war was a formidable ruler. He was physically imposing, with a deep, guttural voice and immense strength. Later chroniclers claim that no other man could draw his bow. He was also ruthlessly efficient. He demolished the unauthorized castles built during his minority and imposed a centralized authority that was rare in Europe at the time. A specific incident at the town of Alençon illustrates his approach to governance and warfare. During a siege, the defenders of the town hung animal skins over the walls and beat them, shouting insults about William's tanner grandfather. When William eventually breached the town, he did not just execute the mockers. He ordered that their hands and feet be cut off. The message was clear: the bastard duke would tolerate no disrespect. Yet, William was more than a brute. He was a pious reformer who worked closely with the church to reorganize the bishoprics of Normandy. He was also a dedicated husband. In the early 1050s, he married Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of a powerful count. The marriage was initially banned by the Pope due to consanguinity. They were distant cousins, but they married anyway. It proved to be a remarkably strong partnership. Matilda was intelligent and capable, often acting as regent in Normandy while William was away on campaigns. It was during this period of consolidation that William's gaze turned toward England. His claim to the English throne relied on two pillars. The first was his blood relationship to Edward the Confessor. William's great-aunt was Edward's mother. The second was a verbal promise. William claimed that when he visited England in 1051, Edward had explicitly promised him the succession. Whether this meeting actually occurred or whether Edward made the promise is a subject of intense historical debate. When Harald Godwinson swore the oath in Normandy in 1064, William considered the matter settled. He had the promise of the king and the sworn loyalty of the most powerful earl. The news of January 1066, therefore, arrived in Normandy as a shock. When a messenger informed William that Edward was dead and that Harold had been crowned king, William reportedly froze. He sat on a bench, covered his face with his cloak, and spoke to no one for a long time. When he emerged, his depression had turned to cold fury. To William, Harold was more than a political rival. He was a perjurer who had insulted God by breaking a holy oath. William immediately began organizing an invasion, but he faced a significant problem. His barons were not interested. Invading England was a logistical nightmare. It required crossing the Channel, a treacherous stretch of water, with thousands of horses and men, to fight a wealthy kingdom with a large army. At a council in Lillebonne, his nobles argued that their feudal obligations required them to fight for him in France, not to cross the sea on a gambling expedition. William had to bribe them. He promised them land and riches in England, wealth that he did not yet possess. He effectively sold shares in the Conquest. He then expanded his recruitment drive beyond Normandy, hiring mercenaries from Brittany, Flanders, and even southern Italy. To solidify his cause, William appealed to the highest power in Europe. He sent an embassy to Rome, detailing Harold's perjury and promising to reform the English Church. Pope Alexander II, influenced by his advisor Archdeacon Hildebrand, sided with William. The Pope sent a papal banner to Normandy. This changed the nature of the enterprise entirely. It had now become a crusade sanctioned by the Vicar of Christ. With his barons convinced and the Church on his side, William began the massive task of construction. Since Normandy did not have a standing navy capable of transporting such a force, William had to build one. Throughout the spring and summer of 1066, the forests of Normandy were felled. Shipwrights worked day and night at the mouth of the River Dives. They built hundreds of transport ships, flat-bottomed vessels designed to carry heavy cavalry horses directly onto a beach. By August 1066, the fleet was ready. William gathered his army, a force estimated at around 7,000 to 8,000 men, including 2,000 cavalry and countless archers. They assembled at Dives-sur-Mer and waited. They needed a northerly wind to carry them across the Channel to the southern coast of England, but the wind blew from the northwest, pinning them in the harbour. For weeks, the army waited. Keeping a medieval army together for a month without them looting the local countryside was an extraordinary feat of discipline enforced by William's strict command. He ensured the soldiers were fed and paid, forbidding any theft from the local population. In September, William moved the fleet to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, hoping for a better angle for the crossing. Still, the winds remained against him. Every day he looked at the weather vane on the church tower, and every day it pointed towards England, indicating the wind was blowing from there, preventing his departure. William did not know it, but this delay was the greatest stroke of luck he could have asked for. Had he sailed in August, he would have met Harold Godwinson's fully prepared army and fleet waiting on the Isle of Wight. The result would likely have been a naval disaster for the Normans. Instead, the winds kept William in France, forcing him to wait while the supplies of the English army across the water ran low. While William gazed at the sky in frustration, praying for the wind to change, events 400 miles to the north were about to clear his path to the throne. The third contender, the King of Norway, had finished his own preparations. Part 3. The last Viking, Harald Hardrada. If William of Normandy was the cold, calculating administrator of the future, Harald Hardrada was the living embodiment of the past. He was the thunderbolt of the North, a man who stepped straight out of the Viking sagas and into the 11th century. His life story is so extraordinary that if it were written as fiction, it would likely be dismissed as unrealistic. Before he ever set foot on English soil in 1066, he had already lived a life that spanned the known world, from the frozen forests of Russia to the deserts of Africa. His name, Hardrada, is an epithet often translated as hard ruler or stern counsel. It fits the man. He was reported to be a physical giant. The sagas claim he stood 7 feet tall with eyebrows, one higher than the other, and hands that could bend horseshoes. While the height may be an exaggeration of the poets, his physical presence and capacity for violence were undeniable. Harald Sigurdsson was born around 1015 in Ringerike, Norway. He was the half-brother of King Olaf II, who would later be canonized as St. Olaf. Harald's military career began at the remarkably young age of 15. In 1030, he fought alongside his brother at the Battle of Stiklestad, attempting to reclaim the Norwegian throne from the forces of King Canute of Denmark. The battle was a disaster. King Olaf was killed, and the teenage Harald was badly wounded. The sagas tell us he was cut off from his men and forced to hide in a remote farmhouse while his wounds healed. He was now a fugitive in his own country, hunted by the agents of Canute. Once he was strong enough to travel, he crossed the mountains into Sweden and then travelled east, into the lands of the Kievan Rus, which is modern-day Russia and Ukraine. This marked the beginning of an exile that would last for 15 years. In Kiev, he was welcomed by Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. The relationship between the Viking world and the Rus was deep. The ruling class of Kiev was of Scandinavian descent. Yaroslav recognized the young warrior's potential and made him a captain in his army. For several years, Harald fought on the eastern frontier of Europe, battling against the Poles and other stepping tribes. But Harald sought greater fortune than the Rus could offer. Around 1034, he took a band of 500 loyal followers and sailed south down the Dnieper River to the greatest city in the Western world, Constantinople. To the Norsemen, this city was known as Mikkelgarth, the Great City. It was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a metropolis of gold, silk and stone that dwarfed the wooden settlements of Scandinavia. Harald went there to serve. He enlisted in the Varangian Guard. This was an elite military unit composed almost entirely of Norsemen and Englishmen. They were the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor, prized for their ferocity and, crucially, their lack of local political ties. They were famous for fighting with massive two-handed axes and for their absolute loyalty to the emperor as long as the emperor could pay. Harold's time in the Varangian Guard is the stuff of legend. Because of his noble birth and obvious talent, he rose quickly through the ranks to become the commander of the Guard. For the next decade, he acted as the emperor's enforcer across the Mediterranean. He led campaigns against Arab pirates in the Aegean Sea. He fought in Asia Minor. He took his men to Jerusalem as soldiers, clearing the roads of bandits to ensure safe passage for the faithful to the Holy Sepulchre. Perhaps his most famous exploits occurred in Sicily. The Byzantine Empire was attempting to reconquer the island from the Saracens. The sagas describe Harold winning 4 battles in Sicily and capturing numerous towns. They recount tales of his cunning that rival the stories of Odysseus. In one instance, unable to breach the walls of a besieged town, Harold is said to have ordered his men to catch the small birds that nested in the town's thatched roofs, but flew out to the fields during the day. He attached burning wood chips to the birds' backs and released them. The birds flew back to their nests, setting the town ablaze from the inside. In another instance, he feigned his own death. His men requested permission to bury their commander inside the city walls. The defenders, relieved that the giant Viking was dead, opened the gates for the funeral procession. Once the coffin was inside, Harold burst out fully armed, and his men sacked the city. Whether these specific details are fact or folklore, the result was tangible. Harold amassed an obscene amount of wealth. The Byzantine custom allowed the Varangians to plunder the emperor's palace whenever an emperor died, and Harold served during the reigns of several emperors. He sent this treasure back north to Yaroslav in Kiev for safekeeping. It consisted of gold, jewels, and precious silks, a war chest intended to buy a kingdom. However, his time in Constantinople ended in danger. In 1042, palace intrigue turned against him. The Empress Zoe, who had reportedly taken a liking to Harold, turned on him when he requested to leave. Some sources suggest he was imprisoned on charges of misappropriating imperial funds. Others suggest he was caught in the middle of a coup. The most dramatic version of events places Harold at the center of the blinding of Emperor Michael V. When the populace rose up against the unpopular emperor, the Varangian Guard, led by Harold, seized him. The sagas claim it was Harold's own hand that gouged out the emperor's eyes. Regardless of the political chaos, Harold realized it was time to leave. He and his men seized 2 ships in the Golden Horn. To prevent escape, the Byzantines had stretched a massive iron chain across the harbour mouth. Harold ordered his rowers to row at full speed toward the chain. As they hit it, he ordered all men not rowing to run to the aft, lifting the ship's bow up onto the chain. Then, at his signal, they all ran forward, using their weight to tip the ship over the chain and into the open sea. One ship broke its back and sank. Harold's ship survived. He returned to Kiev, collected his mountain of gold, and married Elisif, the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise. In 1045, he sailed home to Scandinavia. He returned to a world that had moved on. The Danish king Canute was dead. The king of Norway was now Magnus the Good, the illegitimate son of Harald's brother, St. Olaf. Harold did not immediately attack his nephew. Instead, he used his gold to buy his way in. He agreed to share his wealth with the cash-strapped Magnus in exchange for becoming co-king. Magnus agreed. The arrangement lasted less than a year before Magnus died, possibly of natural causes, though convenient deaths were common around Harold. By 1047, Harald Hardrada was the sole king of Norway. For the next nearly 20 years, he ruled with an iron fist. He spent almost every summer warring with Denmark, attempting to recreate Canute's North Sea Empire. He burned villages, slaughtered opponents, and brutally suppressed any dissent among the Norwegian nobility. It was during this time he earned his name, Hardrada. He was a competent administrator, founding the city of Oslo, but he was first and foremost a warlord. By 1066, Harold was around 50 years old. The long wars with Denmark had ended in a stalemate and a peace treaty. His warriors were restless. He was sitting in Norway, rich and powerful, but with no wars to fight. It was into this atmosphere that Tostig Godwinson arrived. As we heard earlier, Tostig had been exiled by his brother Harald Godwinson. Tostig was desperate. He had been rejected by William of Normandy, who was not yet ready to move. He had been rejected by the King of Denmark. Finally, he sailed to Norway. The meeting between Tostig and Hardrada changed history. Tostig knew exactly which buttons to push. He told the old Viking that the English throne was his by right, based on an old agreement between Magnus the Good and Harthur Canute, the previous king of England. He told him that Harald Godwinson was weak, a man with no royal blood who was disliked by his subjects. He told him that the north of England, Tostig's old earldom, would rise up and welcome them. Tostig flattered Hardrada's ego, appealing to his desire for one last great adventure. He described England as a land of immense wealth, ripe for the taking. Hardrada was sceptical at first. He knew the strength of the English fleet, but the prospect of conquering the kingdom that Canute had once held was too tempting. Hardrada called out the Leidang, the naval levy of Norway. The response was massive. Over 300 ships gathered. Hardrada brought his family, his queen, and his daughters. He brought the entire royal treasury, the gold from Constantinople. He left his son Magnus behind to rule Norway, but he took his younger son Olaf with him. The fleet set sail in August 1066. They stopped first in Shetland and Orkney, gathering reinforcements from the Viking colonies there. Then they turned south. The omens, according to the sagas, were bad. Hardrada's men reported terrifying dreams. One soldier dreamt that he saw the English fleet, and on every ship sat a witch wife, forcing the birds of prey to feast on the corpses of the Norwegians. Hardrada himself dreamt he was visited by the ghost of his brother, Saint Olaf, warning him of doom. Whatever his private fears, Hardrada did not turn back. In early September, the last Viking struck the coast of Northumbria. They raided Scarborough, burning the town by throwing huge bonfires down from the cliffs onto the roofs of the houses, a tactic reminiscent of his days in Sicily. They sailed up the River Humber and landed at Recall, just 10 miles from the great northern capital of York. The local English forces, led by the northern Earls Edwin and Morcar, marched out to meet them. On the 20th of September, 1066, they met at the Battle of Fulford. The battle was a tactical masterclass by Hardrada. He positioned his army with one flank against the River Ouse and the other against a ditch. When the English charged, Hardrada held his best troops in reserve. Once the English were committed, he launched a savage counterattack from the left wing, rolling up the English line and pushing them into the ditch. The slaughter was so great that the Norsemen were said to have walked across the ditch on the bodies of the English dead without getting their feet wet. York surrendered. The city, terrified of being sacked, agreed to give Hardrada hostages and supplies. They agreed to join him in his march south to dethrone Harald Godwinson. Hardrada did not occupy York. Perhaps feeling confident, or perhaps wanting to avoid disease within the city walls, he moved his army a few miles east to a place where the Roman roads crossed the River Derwent. It was a logistical hub known as Stamford Bridge. There, enjoying the late September sun, the Vikings waited. They had defeated the northern earls. They believed the King of England was hundreds of miles away in the south, paralyzed by the threat of the Norman invasion. They thought they had weeks to consolidate their power. They sent their armor back to the ships, keeping only their weapons and shields. They relaxed, confident that the land was already theirs. They were wrong. Harald Godwinson was not in the south. He was racing up the Roman road toward them, leading an army at a pace that no one in the 11th century thought possible. The last Viking was about to meet the King of England. Part 4. The Northern Storm. By the second week of September 1066, the summer was effectively over. For months, King Harald Godwinson had maintained a vigilant watch along the southern coast of England. He had assembled the largest fleet and army in living memory, creating a wall of wood and iron facing the English Channel, waiting for William of Normandy. But maintaining a medieval army in the field was a logistical impossibility for long periods. There were no supply lines. An army ate only what it brought or what it could forage. By September 8th, the provisions were exhausted. Harold looked at the calendar and the weather. The autumn gales were beginning to blow. In the 11th century, naval invasions were strictly seasonal affairs. No sane commander would risk transporting thousands of horses across the Channel once the autumn storms set in. Harold concluded that the threat had passed for the year. He made the difficult decision to disband the peasant militia, allowing them to return to their farms to harvest the crops before winter. He ordered the royal fleet to sail around the coast to London to be refitted. It was a reasonable military decision. It was also a catastrophic error in timing. The very same wind that kept William of Normandy trapped in France was the wind that carried Harald Hardrada across the North Sea. Just days after Harold Godwinson disbanded his southern army, a breathless messenger arrived in London. The news was worse than a simple invasion. The messenger reported that a fleet of 300 ships had entered the Humber estuary. They were more than raiders. It was the King of Norway, and he was accompanied by Tostig Godwinson. Harold Godwinson was now trapped in a strategic nightmare. He was in London. His army was scattering to the winds. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, were fighting for their lives near York, and somewhere across the Channel, William of Normandy was still waiting. A lesser king might have paralysed under the pressure. Harold acted with terrifying speed. He understood that if he did not strike immediately, the north would be lost forever. He sent riders galloping out to recall the housecarls. These were the professional soldiers, the elite bodyguards of the king. Unlike the militia, these men were paid warriors who lived for battle. They wore heavy chainmail hauberks and carried the distinct two-handed Danish axe, a weapon capable of cleaving a shield and the man behind it in a single blow. Within days, Harold had reassembled the core of his army. He then began one of the greatest feats of military endurance in the history of the Middle Ages. The distance from London to York is approximately 185 miles. The roads were old Roman highways degraded by 600 years of neglect. A standard medieval army, burdened by supply wagons and camp followers, might cover 10 to 12 miles a day. Harold Godwinson moved his army at a pace that seemed impossible. He drove them north, covering nearly 40 miles a day, day after day. This had now become a race. The soldiers slept rough, eating cold rations while they walked. Those who could not keep up were left behind in the ditches, while the king pressed on. As he marched, he sent out writs to the shires along the route, demanding that every able-bodied man join the column as it passed. The army grew like a rolling snowball, a mix of elite, mail-clad professionals and local levies armed with spears and farm tools. As they marched, fresh intelligence reached the king. The northern earls had been crushed at the Battle of Fulford. York had capitulated. The city had agreed to exchange hostages with the Vikings and to support Hardrada's claim to the throne. This news added a desperate urgency to the march. Harold had to reach York before the Vikings could fortify the city and before the local nobility fully defected to the invader. On Sunday, the 24th of September, Harold Godwinson reached Tadcaster, a town just 10 miles south of York. He had covered the distance in 4 days. It was a superhuman effort. His men were exhausted, footsore, and battered by the journey, yet their morale was high. They had achieved the impossible. Crucially, Harold had achieved total surprise. The Vikings had no reason to suspect the English king was anywhere nearby. Hardrada believed Harold was still in the south, trembling in fear of William. The Vikings had set up no scouts along the southern roads. Harold entered York quietly on the morning of Monday, the 25th of September. The citizens of York, who had just surrendered to the Vikings days earlier, were stunned to see their own king marching through the gates. Harold ordered the city to be sealed. No one was allowed to leave. He needed to ensure that no word of his arrival leaked out to the Viking camp. Through the local people, Harold learned the location of the enemy. They were resting 7 miles to the east at a crossing point on the River Derwent known as Stamford Bridge. They were waiting for the hostages from York to be delivered to them. Harold looked at his exhausted men. They had just marched 185 miles in 4 days. They deserved rest and sleep. But Harold knew that the element of surprise was a powerful weapon. He ordered the army to form up. They would not rest. They would march another 7 miles and deliver the hostages to the Vikings personally. As the English army crested the ridge at Gate Fulford, the sun was shining on a warm late September day. Below them, in the valley of the Derwent, lay the unsuspecting Norwegian army. The stage was set for the end of the Viking Age. Part 5. The Battle of Stamford Bridge. On the morning of the 25th of September 1066, the Norwegian army was relaxed. They were encamped on the eastern side of the River Derwent, a few miles from York. The weather was unseasonably warm for late September in northern England. Because of the heat and their confidence that the English army was hundreds of miles away in London, the Vikings made a decision that would prove fatal. They left their heavy mail armor back at their ships at Recal. Most of the warriors were dressed only in tunics, carrying their shields, swords, and axes. They believed they were marching to a meeting to receive hostages and tribute, not to a battle. Around noon, the Viking sentries noticed a cloud of dust rising on the horizon to the west, coming from the direction of York. At first, Harald Hardrada believed this was the group of hostages he was expecting. He told his men to remain calm. But as the cloud drew closer, the dust gave way to the glint of sunlight reflecting off thousands of metal helmets and spear tips. The Norse sagas describe the approaching army as looking like a field of broken ice shimmering in the sun. Instead of a delegation of hostages, it was the full might of the English army, led by King Harald Godwinson. Realizing he had been caught completely off guard, Hardrada had to think quickly. His army was split. 1/3 of his forces were miles away guarding the ships. He sent his fastest riders to summon them. For the troops he had with him, he ordered them to cross the bridge to the east bank of the Derwent. He knew he could not fight the English in the open field without armor. He needed to form a defensive circle on higher ground. However, a portion of his army was still on the west bank of the river. These men were ordered to hold the English back for as long as possible to buy time for the main force to deploy. The English housecarls smashed into this rear guard. The skirmish was brief and brutal. Without their armor, the Vikings on the west bank were slaughtered or driven into the river to drown. The English army surged forward, reaching the wooden bridge that spanned the Derwent. This bridge was the only way to cross the river to reach Hardrada's main force. It is here that the battle produced one of the most enduring legends of English history. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the English advance was halted by a single man. A giant Norwegian warrior whose name has been lost to history took his stand in the middle of the narrow bridge. He wielded a massive two-handed Danish axe. The bridge was likely only wide enough for 2 or 3 men to walk abreast, creating a choke point that neutralized the English numerical advantage. For a significant amount of time, this lone berserker held the entire English army at bay. The English soldiers charged him in groups, but the Viking cut them down one by one. The reach of his axe was so long that he could strike the English before they could get close enough to use their swords. The Chronicle claims he killed 40 English soldiers single-handedly. The pile of bodies blocked a bridge, adding to the obstacle. The English attempted to shoot him with arrows, but his large shield and the frantic movement of the melee protected him. Harald Godwinson could not afford this delay. Every minute the giant held the bridge was a minute Hardrada used to organize his shield wall. The solution was ingenious and pragmatic. An English soldier found a swill tub or a small boat, possibly used for maintenance under the bridge. He floated down the river, maneuvering himself directly underneath the wooden planks where the Vikings stood. Through the gaps in the timber, the soldier could see the warrior above. He thrust a long spear upward between the planks, striking the Viking in the groin. The giant collapsed in agony, and the English army poured across the bridge. With the river crossed, the main phase of the battle began. Harald Hardrada had formed his men into a defensive circle, a shield wall designed to repel attacks from all sides. He planted his banner, the Land Waster, in the center. Before the general engagement, a solitary figure rode out from the English lines. The rider approached the Viking shield wall and called out for Tostig Godwinson. Tostig stepped forward. The rider offered Tostig his earldom back if he would drop his weapons and return to the side of his brother. Tostig asked what the King of England would offer his ally, Harald Hardrada. The rider replied with a line that has echoed through history. "We will give him 7 feet of English ground, or as much more as he is taller than other men." The rider then turned and rode back to the English lines. Puzzled, Hardrada asked Tostig who the man was. Tostig replied that it was his brother, King Harald Godwinson. Hardrada reportedly remarked that had he known, the king would never have left the meeting alive. Tostig replied that he could not be the one to murder his brother under a flag of truce. The negotiations were over. The English army charged. The battle that followed was long and bloody. The Vikings fought with the desperation of men who knew they had no escape. However, the lack of armor was the deciding factor. The English housecarls, protected by chainmail, hacked into the unarmoured Viking ranks. The Norsemen fell in droves. Harald Hardrada, seeing his line beginning to buckle, entered a state of berserkergang, a battle fury. He threw away his shield and charged into the English ranks, swinging his sword with both hands. The sagas say he cut through the English like he was walking through corn. For a moment, it seemed the giant king might turn the tide by sheer force of will. But the age of Viking heroics was ending. An English archer fired a random arrow into the melee. It struck Hardrada in the throat. The King of Norway paused, choked on his own blood, and fell dead. The fighting paused briefly. Harald Godwinson once again offered peace to his brother Tostig and the surviving Norwegians. He told them they could leave with their lives if they surrendered. Tostig refused. The surviving Vikings shouted that they would rather fall one across the other than accept quarter from the English. The battle resumed with even greater ferocity. Tostig was soon killed, joining the king he had invited to conquer his home. Late in the afternoon, the final phase of the tragedy unfolded. The Viking reinforcements from the ships finally arrived. They had run nearly 15 miles in the blazing heat, wearing full heavy armor because they expected a battle. By the time they reached Stamford Bridge, they were already exhausted. Many collapsed and died from heatstroke and exhaustion before they even struck a blow. The Vikings called this Ore's Storm, named after Eystein Ore, the commander of the relief force. They threw off their armor to fight, but this only made them vulnerable to the English blades. By nightfall, the carnage was complete. The Norwegian army was virtually annihilated. Of the 300 ships that had sailed from Norway, Harald Godwinson allowed the survivors to leave in just 24. He made the king's son, Olaf, swear an oath never to attack England again and sent him home. The English victory was absolute. The greatest warrior of the age, Harald Hardrada, was dead. The internal threat of Tostig was removed. Harald Godwinson had saved his kingdom and proven himself to be one of the greatest generals England had ever produced. But the victory came at a terrible price. The English army was battered. Many of the king's best housecarls lay dead on the banks of the Derwent. The survivors were exhausted, many suffering from wounds and the fatigue of the march. While the English soldiers were celebrating their victory and stripping the armor from the Viking dead, the wind changed. 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the weather vane on the church tower in Normandy finally turned. The southerly wind that William had prayed for had arrived. On the 28th of September, William of Normandy launched his fleet. Harald Godwinson was sitting at a victory feast in York when the messenger arrived. The news was a cruel irony. He had defeated the invasion in the north, only to be told that the invasion in the south had just begun. He looked at his tired men who had just performed a miracle. He told them to stand up. They had to march back. They had to go south. Part 6. The Southern Wind. On the evening of the 27th of September 1066, just 2 days after the slaughter at Stamford Bridge, the wind in the English Channel finally shifted. For weeks, the northerly gales had acted as a shield for England, trapping the Norman fleet in the harbour of St. Valery. Now, the breeze blew strongly from the south. To William of Normandy, this was a sign of divine favour. God had waited until the moment was right. William ordered his fleet to launch immediately. It was a massive logistical undertaking involving hundreds of ships carrying roughly 7,000 men and, crucially, over 2,000 war horses. The crossing took place overnight. William's flagship, the Mora, was a gift from his wife, Matilda. It was faster than the heavy transport barges and, in the darkness, it outpaced the rest of the fleet. When the sun rose on the morning of the 28th of September, William found himself alone in the middle of the channel, with no other ships in sight. It was a moment of extreme peril. Had an English patrol fleet been nearby, the invasion would have ended there. However, the English fleet was currently docked in London, miles away. William calmly ordered a breakfast to be served and waited for his armada to appear on the horizon. By mid-morning, the Norman fleet landed at Pevensey Bay on the Sussex coast. They arrived at a ghost coast. There were no coastguards, no ships, and no army to contest the landing. Harold Godwinson's decision to disband the militia earlier in September, followed by his forced march to the north, had left the southern door of England wide open. As William stepped off his ship to claim his kingdom, disaster nearly struck. According to contemporary chroniclers, he slipped on the wet shingle and fell face forward onto the beach. A collective gasp went through his retinue. In the medieval world, falling upon arrival was seen as a terrible omen, a sign that the land was rejecting the invader. William, displaying his quick wit and presence of mind, scrambled to his feet with his hands full of wet sand and grit. He held his fists up to his men and shouted that there was no bad omen, for he had taken England with both his hands. The Normans did not stay at Pevensey. They moved east to Hastings, a more defensible position with a natural harbour. Here, they utilised a piece of technology that was alien to the English, the pre-fabricated castle. They brought wooden timbers, pre-cut and shaped in Normandy, which they assembled on top of an existing mound. Within days, they had a functioning fortress to serve as a base of operations. William then began to bait the trap. He knew that Harold Godwinson was a man of action, a king who took his responsibilities seriously. William also knew that Sussex was the ancestral home of the Godwin family. To force Harold to come to him, William began to systematically ravage the countryside. His soldiers burned villages, destroyed crops, and slaughtered the local peasantry. He was essentially burning Harold's own backyard. Word of the landing reached Harald Godwinson in York around the 1st of October. The king was still celebrating his victory over Harald Hardrada. He was likely tending to his wounded men and organising the administration of the shaken northern counties. The news must have been a crushing psychological blow. He had done everything right. He had defeated the greatest warrior of the age. He had saved his kingdom. And now he was told that he had to do it all over again against a fresh enemy with a battered army 400 miles away. Harold made a controversial decision. He did not rest his men for a week to allow them to recover. He did not wait for the full levy of the northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, to reorganize and join him. He left the north almost immediately. He rode south at a furious pace, leaving his infantry to follow as best they could. He reached London around the 6th of October. He stayed there for roughly a week, gathering what fresh forces he could. He sent out writs to the surrounding shires, demanding every available man. His mother, Geitha, begged him to stay in London and let his brothers lead the army, or at least to wait until the Normans were forced to extend their supply lines. Harold refused. He was enraged by the reports of William burning Sussex. He believed that, as king, it was his duty to protect his people, not to hide behind walls while they suffered. On the 13th of October, Harold led his army out of London. They marched south toward Hastings. The English army was a mix of the exhausted survivors of Stamford Bridge and fresh, inexperienced levies picked up along the way. They were moving into a trap, but Harold was confident. He had defeated the King of Norway. He believed he could defeat the bastard of Normandy. By the evening of the 13th of October, the English army arrived at a ridge known as Senlac Hill, about 6 miles northwest of Hastings. They were tired, they were hungry, and they were facing an enemy who had been resting and eating well for 2 weeks. As the sun set, the English could see the glow of the Norman campfires in the distance. The race was over. The war for England would be decided in the morning. Part 7. The Battle of Hastings. On the morning of Saturday, the 14th of October 1066, the sun rose over the ridge of Senlac Hill. The local dawn was at roughly 6:45 in the morning. As the light filtered through the autumn mist, it revealed the tactical disposition of the two armies that were about to decide the fate of England. King Harold Godwinson had chosen his ground well. He had deployed his army along the crest of a ridge that was approximately 800 yards long. The position was formidable. To the rear, the ground fell away steeply into the Ondrusweld forest, protecting his back. To the front, the ground sloped down into a marshy valley before rising again to Telham Hill, where the Normans were assembled. Any attacking force would have to cross the valley floor and then fight their way uphill against gravity into the teeth of the English formation. The English army, numbering perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 men, was fighting entirely on foot. This was the traditional Anglo-Saxon style of war. At the front stood the housecarls. These were the professional soldiers, the men who had marched the length of the country and back again. They were clad in knee-length chainmail hauberks that weighed roughly 30 pounds. On their heads they wore conical iron helmets with a nasal bar to protect the face. They carried kite-shaped shields made of lime wood, covered in leather and rimmed with iron. When these shields were locked together, overlapping rim to rim, they formed the famous shield wall, a continuous barrier of wood and iron that was nearly impenetrable to arrows or casual sword strikes. Behind the wall of shields stood the housecarl's primary offensive weapon, the great Danish axe. This was a two-handed weapon with a shaft up to 5 feet long and a heavy, razor-sharp iron head. It was a weapon designed for one purpose: to destroy shields and armor. A single blow from a Danish axe could cleave through a horse's neck or split a knight from shoulder to hip. Behind the elite housecarls stood the feared, the general levy. These men were less well equipped, armed with spears, swords and agricultural flails, but their morale was high. They were packed in deep, perhaps 10 to 12 ranks, creating a dense mass of humanity that anchored the ridge. In the centre of the line flew the banners of the king, the Dragon of Wessex and the Fighting Man, Harold's personal standard stitched with gold and gems. Across the valley, less than 400 yards away, William of Normandy arranged his forces. Unlike the monolithic block of the English, the Norman army was a complex machine of combined arms. William had divided his army into 3 distinct divisions based on their regional origins. On the left were the Bretons, commanded by Alan the Red. On the right were the French and Flemish mercenaries, commanded by Eustace of Boulogne. In the centre were the Normans, commanded by William himself. Each of these divisions was further stratified into 3 lines. The first line consisted of archers and crossbowmen. The second line was heavy infantry, armoured in mail similar to the English. The third line was the shock force, the heavy cavalry. These were the knights, riding powerful destriers and armed with lances and swords. This disposition revealed William's plan. He intended to soften the English with missiles, break up the shield wall with infantry, and then shatter the formation with a cavalry charge. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, a trumpet sounded from the Norman lines. The battle began. The first phase was the opening barrage. William ordered his archers to advance to within range and loose their arrows into the English ranks. Under normal circumstances, a volley of thousands of arrows would devastate an enemy formation. However, the topography of Senlac Hill worked against the Normans. Because the English were standing on a ridge, the archers had to shoot uphill. This meant the arrows lost significant velocity by the time they reached the target. Furthermore, the angle was wrong. Arrows either embedded themselves harmlessly in the interlocking shields of the front rank or flew high over the heads of the English, landing uselessly in the forest behind them. The shield wall remained intact. Seeing that the missiles were ineffective, William ordered his infantry to advance. The heavy foot soldiers marched up the slope. As they neared the English line, they were met with a storm of missiles from the English side spears, javelins, and throwing axes. The English did not have many archers, but they had plenty of thrown weapons. The Norman infantry crashed into the shield wall, and the sound of the impact was reported to be deafening, a thunderclap of wood on wood and iron on iron. The fighting was brutal and intimate. It was a shoving match. The Normans tried to hack their way through the wall, while the English used their height advantage to stab downward with spears and crush helmets with their axes. The English doctrine was purely defensive. They did not need to kill every Norman, they simply needed to hold the hill until nightfall. If William could not break the line, he would have to retreat, and his army would likely starve or disintegrate. The Norman infantry failed to make a breach. They fell back, exhausted and bloodied. William now played his trump card. He signalled for the cavalry. Thousands of knights spurred their horses up the slope. This was the weapon that dominated continental warfare, but the English were not intimidated. They had fought mounted enemies before. The shield wall held firm. Contrary to popular belief, horses will not charge blindly into a solid wall of wood and men. They will swerve or stop. The Norman knights were forced to ride up to the shield wall, poke with their lances, and try to hack at the English. In this static melee, the horsemen were at a disadvantage. The English housecarls stepped forward with their great axes. They targeted the horses. A horse with a severed leg would collapse, throwing its rider to the ground where he could be easily finished off. For an hour the battle raged in a stalemate. The Normans attacked, failed, and fell back. The English shouted, "Ut! Ut!" meaning "out! Out!" as they repelled wave after wave. Then, around midday, came the crisis that nearly lost William the war. The Breton division on the Norman left flank began to waver. They had taken heavy casualties from the English missile fire and the savage axework of the housecarls. Under the pressure, the Bretons broke. They turned and fled down the hill toward the marshy ground. Seeing the enemy retreat, the English troops on the right flank lost their discipline. Ignoring the king's orders to hold the line, hundreds of English soldiers broke formation and charged down the hill to pursue the fleeing Bretons. Panic spread through the Norman army. As the Bretons fled, the central Norman division became exposed. To make matters worse, a rumour swept through the ranks like wildfire. William had not been seen for some time in the chaos. If the Duke was dead, the war was over. The Norman centre began to pull back. The entire invasion force was on the brink of a rout. William of Normandy saw the disaster unfolding. He removed his helmet, exposing his face to his troops. He rode in front of his retreating men, shouting above the din of battle. According to the chronicler William of Poitiers, the Duke roared, "Look at me, I am alive, and by the grace of God I will conquer." His display of courage steadied the line. The Normans stopped running. William then turned his knights toward the English soldiers who had foolishly charged down the hill. Caught in the open valley without the protection of the shield wall and the high ground, the English pursuers were easy prey. The Norman cavalry surrounded them and cut them to pieces. The crisis was averted, but the situation on the hill remained unchanged. The main English shield wall was still intact, though slightly thinned. The afternoon settled into a grueling war of attrition. The battle had been raging for hours, which was unusual for the time. Medieval battles were often decided in an hour or two. This was a slugging match between two evenly matched heavyweights. William, however, had learned a crucial lesson from the near disaster on the left flank. He had seen that the English were susceptible to the temptation of pursuit. He decided to weaponize this lack of discipline. Throughout the afternoon, William ordered his cavalry to perform feigned retreats. A squadron of knights would charge up the hill, engage the English briefly, and then turn and pretend to flee in panic. The English, sensing victory and eager to exact revenge for the invasion, would break the shield wall to chase them. Once the English were far enough down the slope, the knights would wheel around, and fresh Norman cavalry would sweep in from the sides to slaughter the isolated Englishmen. Historians have debated whether these maneuvers were pre-planned drills or improvisations, but the result was undeniable. The tactic was used repeatedly. Each time, it drew a few hundred Englishmen to their deaths. The shield wall, once a solid rampart of thousands, began to fray. Gaps appeared. The line shortened. The English dead began to pile up in ridges, making movement difficult on the hilltop. Despite these losses, Harald Godwinson held the centre. He stood by his banner, surrounded by his brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, and his personal housecarls. As long as the king stood and the core of the army remained, England was not lost. The sun began to dip toward the horizon. It was late afternoon. The English were exhausted. They had been standing, fighting and dying for 7 hours. They were dehydrated and fatigued from the weight of their armor. The Normans were equally tired, but they had the psychological momentum. William ordered one final, all-out assault. He synchronized his forces for a combined attack. He ordered his archers to change their tactics. Instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, he ordered them to aim high into the air, using a high-angle trajectory. The arrows would fall almost vertically, like lethal rain, behind the English shields. This tactical shift was devastating. The English soldiers could not lift their shields to protect their heads without exposing their bodies to the Norman infantry advancing up the slope. They had to choose between being stabbed in the gut or struck from above. The arrow storm caused chaos in the tightly packed English ranks. Men fell where they stood, creating gaps that the Norman infantry exploited. Simultaneously, the Norman heavy cavalry charged again. This time, the English line was too thin and too battered to hold the surge. The knights punched through the shield wall. The battle dissolved into a series of desperate, fragmented melees. The defensive structure that had held William at bay all day finally collapsed. It was in this final, chaotic hour, as the twilight approached, that the leadership of Anglo-Saxon England was decapitated. First, Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, were killed. They had fought alongside the king all day, but they were overwhelmed by the Norman knights. Their deaths left Harold alone to command the disintegrating army. Then, the king himself fell. The exact manner of Harald Godwinson's death is a subject of one of history's most famous debates. The Bayeux Tapestry, the primary visual source of the battle, depicts a figure clutching an arrow that has pierced his right eye. Above him, the Latin text reads, Harold rex interfectus est. King Harold is killed. This image of the arrow in the eye has become the defining symbol of the Conquest, representing the role of chance or divine judgment in William's victory. However, other contemporary sources suggest a more brutal, less random end. The Song of the Battle of Hastings, written shortly after the event, describes a squad of 4 Norman knights breaking through the housecarls to reach the king. The first knight stabbed Harold through the shield and into his chest. The second struck him in the head. The third disemboweled him. The fourth hacked off his leg. It is highly probable that both accounts contain truth. Harold may have been wounded by the arrow storm, rendering him unable to defend himself against the final cavalry charge. Whatever the specific weapon, the result was the same. Harald Godwinson, the King of England, was dead. With the death of the king, the English resistance collapsed. The Fyrd, the peasant levy, fled into the darkening forest. The housecarls, bound by their code of honour to die with their lord, fought on. They gathered around the fallen body of the king and fought until they were all killed. The battle did not end instantly. In the darkness, a group of pursuing Norman knights rode into a hidden ravine or ditch behind the ridge, known later as the Malfosse or Evil Ditch. The fleeing Englishmen turned and slaughtered the trapped knights. It was a final, spiteful sting from the dying army, but it changed nothing. By 8 o'clock in the evening, silence fell over Senlac Hill. The field was covered with thousands of bodies. William of Normandy rode back to the crest of the hill, the spot where Harold's banner had flown just hours before. He ordered his tent to be pitched among the dead. He knelt and gave thanks to God for the victory. The cost was staggering. It is estimated that half of the English nobility died on that field. The Godwin family was effectively wiped out. The Normans had suffered heavily as well, with perhaps 2,000 casualties, but they held the field. William refused to give Harold a royal burial. When Harold's mother offered William the weight of her son's body in gold for his return, William refused. He stated that a man who had guarded the coast with such zeal should be buried on the coast. Harold was buried in a secret, unconsecrated grave, though later legends say his body was moved to Waltham Abbey. The Battle of Hastings was over. In a single day, the political structure of England had been decapitated. There was no adult heir to take Harold's place. There was no army left to defend London. The road to the capital was open. The Anglo-Saxon era, which had lasted for 600 years, had died on the ridge with its king. The Norman age had begun. Part 8. The Pacification and the Harrying of the North. History often condenses the Norman conquest into a single day. The popular narrative suggests that when Harald Godwinson died at Hastings, England simply accepted William as its new king. The reality was far more complex and far more brutal. The Battle of Hastings was merely the opening move in a violent campaign of subjugation that would last for 5 years. The English did not welcome the Normans. They resisted them in the marshes, in the forests, and in the streets of their towns. William's response to this resistance will leave a scar on the English landscape that is still visible in the historical records 1,000 years later. Immediately after the Battle of Hastings, William did not march on London. He knew that the city was fortified and filled with citizens who might oppose him. Instead, he waited at Hastings, expecting the surviving English nobility to come to him and submit. When no one came, William began a campaign of intimidation. He marched his army in a wide circle around London, burning the towns of Romney, Dover, and Canterbury, and devastating the countryside of Surrey and Berkshire. He effectively cut off the capital's supply lines. The strategy worked. The English will to resist crumbled. At Berkhamsted, the remaining English leaders, including the northern earls Edwin and Morcar and the young Edgar Atheling, the last male heir of the old royal line, submitted to William. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony itself became a metaphor for his reign. When the congregation inside the abbey shouted their acclaim for the new king, the Norman guards stationed outside mistook the noise for a riot. In a panic, they began setting fire to the neighboring houses. The coronation ended in chaos, with smoke filling the church and the congregation fleeing, leaving William trembling on the altar. It was an ominous beginning. The first 2 years of William's reign were characterized by constant, localized rebellions. The English realized that the Normans were not just a new political layer, they were a replacement force. The Normans seized land, built castles, and imposed heavy taxes. In 1067, while William was back in Normandy celebrating his victory, rebellions broke out in Kent and the Welsh Marches. In 1068, the city of Exeter refused to acknowledge William's rule. The king marched west, besieged the city for 18 days, and forced its surrender. To control this hostile population, William embarked on a massive building program. This was the era of the Motte and Bailey Castle. In every major town he captured, William cleared dozens of houses to build a defensive mound topped with a wooden keep. These were more than military fortifications. They were symbols of psychological domination, looming over the English towns as a constant reminder of who was in charge. However, the greatest threat to William's rule lay in the north. The people of Northumbria and Yorkshire had always been distinct from the south of England. They were culturally Scandinavian, fierce, and historically independent. They had not participated in the Battle of Hastings, and their military strength was largely intact. In January 1069, the north exploded. The catalyst was the arrival of a new Norman Earl, Robert de Comines. He arrived in Durham with a force of several hundred men, acting with the arrogance of a conqueror. He allowed his men to loot and abuse the local population. The Northumbrians did not tolerate this for long. Under the cover of darkness, a local war band broke into the city, surrounded the house where the Earl was sleeping, and set it on fire. The Earl and his entire retinue were killed. This success sparked a general uprising. The citizens of York declared for Edgar Atheling, the teenage Anglo-Saxon prince. But the situation became truly critical for William in the summer of 1069. A fleet of 240 ships appeared off the coast of Kent. It was King Sweyn of Denmark. The Danish king saw the chaos in England as an opportunity. The Danish fleet sailed north, linking up with the English rebels in the Humber estuary. It was a nightmare scenario for William, a united Anglo-Danish army supported by a popular uprising. The combined force marched on York. The Norman garrison in the city, fearing the approaching army, set fire to the houses near the castle to clear their fields of fire. The flames grew out of control, destroying the city and the minster. In the confusion, the Danes and English rebels stormed the walls. The Norman garrison was massacred. 3,000 Normans were killed. It was the single greatest loss of life for the Normans in the entire conquest. When William heard the news, he was hunting in the forest of Dean. Sources say he fell into a savage rage. He swore an oath by the splendor of God to avenge the insult. He abandoned his campaigns in the south and marched north. William's strategy was cold and pragmatic. He knew he could not defeat the Danes in a naval war, so he resorted to bribery. He sent secret messengers to the Danish commanders, offering them a massive sum of gold and silver if they would simply return to their ships and leave England. The Danes, more interested in profit than in helping the English, accepted the bribe. They sailed away, leaving the northern rebels alone to face the wrath of William. William arrived in Yorkshire in the winter of 1069. He did not come to fight a battle. The rebels melted away into the hills and forests at his approach. He came to ensure that the North could never rebel again. What followed is known to history as the Harrying of the North. It was a systematic campaign of genocide by starvation. William divided his army into small raiding parties and spread them out across the countryside of Yorkshire, Durham, and Cheshire. Their orders were not just to kill rebels, but to destroy the means of life. The Norman soldiers burned every village they found. They slaughtered every farm animal, cows, sheep, pigs, and oxen. Crucially, they destroyed the agricultural infrastructure. They smashed the ploughs and carts. They burned the barns filled with the winter harvest. Most devastating of all, they salted the earth and destroyed the seed grain that was meant for the spring planting. William intended to create a desert. He wanted to ensure that no army, whether English or Danish, could ever find food in the north again. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe. The chronicler Alderic Vitalis, who was half English and half Norman, usually wrote in praise of William. But when he described the harrying of the north, his tone changed to one of horror. He wrote, "He made no effort to restrain his fury, punishing the innocent with the guilty. In his anger he commanded that all crops and herds, chattels and food of every kind should be brought together and burned to ashes with consuming fire, so that the whole region north of the Humber might be stripped of all means of sustenance." Vitalis goes on to estimate that 100,000 people of both sexes and all ages perished. In the 11th century, when the total population of England was perhaps 2 million, this was a staggering figure. It was equivalent to 5% of the entire population dying in a single winter. The survivors were reduced to primal desperation. Contemporary accounts describe walking ghosts, wandering the roads. People ate their horses, then their dogs, and finally they ate grass and roots. There are credible reports of cannibalism, with starving people eating the flesh of the dead. Refugees flooded south or north into Scotland, carrying stories of the apocalypse that had visited their lands. The Evesham Chronicle records that refugees arrived at the abbey in such a state of starvation that they died as soon as they ate food, their bodies too weak to digest it. The devastation was so total that it was recorded in the administrative data of the kingdom for decades. 17 years later, when the Domesday Book was compiled, the surveyors went through Yorkshire. Time and again, next to the names of once prosperous manors and villages, the book contains a single, chilling Latin word, vasta. It means waste. 60% of all the waste entries in the entire Domesday Book are found in Yorkshire. Some estimates suggest that the population of the north did not recover to its pre-conquest levels until the late Middle Ages. William spent Christmas of 1069 in the ruins of York. He had his crown and regalia brought up from Winchester to wear for the holiday, a display of power amidst the ashes. He then led his army across the Pennines in a winter march to crush the last pockets of resistance in Cheshire. The conditions were so bad that his own mercenaries from the continent mutinied, refusing to march further in the freezing snow. William simply ignored them and marched on, forcing his men to follow. By the spring of 1070, the conquest was truly complete. The English aristocracy was dead or in exile. The fighting spirit of the north was broken. The harrying of the north taught the English a terrible lesson. Resistance would lead to more than military defeat, it would lead to extinction. There would be one final flicker of resistance in the fenlands of East Anglia, led by a minor noble named Hereward the Wake, who held out on the Isle of Ely until 1071. But after the devastation of the north, there was no longer any hope of a national uprising. The English people turned their focus from fighting the Normans to simply surviving them. With the sword, William had cleared the land. Now, he needed to know exactly what he had won. As the fires in the north burned out, the king turned his mind from destruction to administration. He needed to catalogue his spoils. He needed to tax his new subjects. He needed the Domesday Book. Part 9. The Domesday Book. By the winter of 1085, nearly 2 decades had passed since the Battle of Hastings. King William was now in his late 50s. The dashing young warrior who had charged up Senlac Hill was gone. In his place sat a man who had grown corpulent and stern, a monarch hardened by 20 years of suppressing rebellions and fighting border wars. He had conquered the land with the sword, but he now realized that he did not fully understand the kingdom he ruled. The catalyst for the Great Survey, as it was originally known, was a threat from the past. In 1085, news reached England that King Canute IV of Denmark was assembling a massive fleet to invade England in alliance with the Count of Flanders. It was the nightmare of 1066 all over again. William responded by hiring a vast army of mercenaries from France and billeting them across England in the homes of his subjects. The invasion never materialized. Canute was murdered in a church by his own rebels before he could sail. However, the crisis exposed a critical weakness in William's administration. When he tried to raise money to pay his mercenaries and assess how many soldiers his barons could provide, the system failed. The records were old, based on Anglo-Saxon tax assessments that were centuries out of date. Estates had changed hands dozens of times during the chaos of the Conquest. Boundaries had shifted. William realized that he was the king of a land that was, administratively speaking, a mystery to him. At Christmas 1085, William held court of Gloucester. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the king had much thought and deep speech with his council about the land of England and its people. From this meeting emerged the royal command that was unprecedented in the history of medieval Europe. William ordered a complete survey of his entire kingdom. He wanted to know exactly who owned every inch of land, what it was worth, and how much tax it could generate. The speed at which this operation was conducted is staggering. In the 11th century, there was no central database, no postal service, and no road network. Yet, William demanded the work be finished within a year. To achieve this, the king divided England into 7 circuits. He appointed groups of commissioners to each circuit. Crucially, these commissioners were strangers to the areas they surveyed. They were men with no local ties, no friends to favour, and no enemies to punish. They were impartial auditors sent from the king. These commissioners travelled from county to county, setting up public inquiries in the shire courts. This was not a simple questionnaire sent to the local lord, it was a legal investigation. In every district, the commissioners summoned a jury consisting of the sheriff, the local priest, the reeve, and 6 peasants from each village. These men were put under oath and forced to testify about the wealth of their neighbours and their masters. The questions they were asked were intrusive and exhaustive. The text of the survey lists the standard interrogation. What is the name of this manor? Who held it in the time of King Edward the Confessor? Who holds it now? How many hides of land are there? How many ploughs are in the lordship? How many villagers? How many cottages? How many slaves? How much woodland? How much meadow? How many mills? How many fish ponds? And finally, what is the total value of the manor now, and what was it worth in 1066? The thoroughness of the survey shocked the English population. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by a monk who likely witnessed the process, recorded the resentment of the people. He wrote to his bitterness that, so very narrowly did he have it investigated, that there was no single hide nor yard of land, nor indeed one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig was there left out, and not put down in his record. To the English, this was a violation of privacy and a symbol of their total subjugation. In the medieval mind, counting people and property was often associated with sin. The Bible told of King David bringing a plague upon Israel for conducting a census. But for William, this was a necessity of control. He needed to know the financial potential of his kingdom to the last penny. The data collected by the commissioners was written on sheepskin parchments and sent to Winchester, the royal treasury. There, a single scribe, or perhaps a small team, undertook the monumental task of abbreviating, organizing, and copying the returns into a single volume. The result was 2 books. The first, known as Little Domesday, covered Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk. It was likely the first draft, containing far more detail, including counts of livestock. The second, known as Great Domesday, covered the rest of England. It was more concise, omitting the livestock counts to save space, but covering a much wider area. Together, these documents form the earliest public record in England. The official name of the document was the Book of Winchester, but the English people gave it a different name. They called it the Domesday Book. The name is a reference to the biblical Day of Doom, or Judgment Day. The analogy was clear. On Judgment Day, Christ would open the Book of Life, and his decision on every soul would be final and unalterable. There was no appeal against God's judgment. Similarly, once a piece of land or a tax obligation was written in William's book, it was final. There was no appeal. The book was the ultimate authority. While the Domesday Book was created as a tax document, for historians it serves as a photograph of a society that had been completely decapitated. By comparing the entries for 1066, the time of King Edward, with the entries for 1086, we can see the enormous scale of the Norman takeover. The statistics are sobering. In 1066, there were approximately 4,000 to 5,000 English thegn and zi, the local aristocracy, holding land directly from the king. By 1086, that class had been wiped out. The Domesday Book reveals that just 200 Norman barons controlled almost all the land in England. Only 2 Englishmen are listed as major landholders, and even they held only a fraction of their former estate. The rest of the English nobility had either died at Hastings, fled into exile, or been demoted to the status of tenant farmers on land they once owned. The book also sheds light on the social structure of the time. It records that roughly 10% of the population were slaves, men and women who were treated as property, bought and sold like cattle. This creates a stark contrast with the later medieval period. Within a century of the conquest, chattel slavery would largely disappear from England, replaced by the system of serfdom. Most chillingly, the Domesday Book provides forensic evidence of the violence we discussed earlier. In the entries for Yorkshire and the North, the shadow of the harrying of the North is still visible 17 years later. Time and again, the scribe writes a single Latin word next to the entry for a manor, vasta. It means waste. In some districts of Yorkshire, 60% of the manors are recorded as waste. These were villages that had been burned and never rebuilt, fields that had returned to scrubland, and communities that had been extinguished. The tax value of these lands had plummeted to zero. It is a bureaucratic echo of a genocide, a cold administrative record of the fires William had lit in 1069. The process of the survey culminated in a grand political theatre. In August 1086, shortly after the data was collected, William summoned his nobility to Salisbury. This event, known as the Oath of Salisbury, was the final seal on the conquest. In the feudal system of France, a knight swore loyalty to his lord, and that lord swore loyalty to the king. A knight's primary loyalty was to his immediate superior, not necessarily the monarch. William broke this chain. At Salisbury, he forced every landholder of any significance to swear an oath of allegiance directly to him. The Domesday Book made this possible. William now knew exactly who held every scrap of land. He could bypass the great barons and reach down to the lower gentry. He used the information to ensure that every sword in England was loyal to him above all others. However, William did not live long to enjoy this total control. The Domesday Survey was completed in 1086. The following year, 1087, William returned to France to fight a border war against the French king. During the burning of the town of Mantes, William was injured. Some accounts say the pommel of his saddle drove into his stomach when his horse stumbled. He suffered a rupture and a slow, agonizing death. He died on the 9th of September, 1087, at the convent of Saint-Gervais near Rouen. The end of the conqueror was undignified. His servants stripped his body of his weapons and clothes and fled. When the clergy finally arranged for his burial in the Abbaye aux Hommes in Caen, the stone sarcophagus was too small for his obese corpse. When the attendants tried to force the body into the coffin, the corpse burst, filling the church with a foul smell that forced the mourners to rush through the service. It was a gruesome end for a man who had reshaped history. But while William's body rotted, his legacy remained. He left behind a kingdom that was fundamentally transformed. The Anglo-Saxon England of Edward the Confessor, a land looking north to Scandinavia, governed by a loose confederation of earls, was gone. In its place was a centralized state, looking south to Europe, governed by a French-speaking military aristocracy. The Domesday Book was placed in the royal treasury, where it remained the definitive legal document of land ownership for centuries. It was said that the book was so authoritative that it was consulted even into the Victorian era for disputes regarding ancient land rights. The Norman Conquest was more than a change of management, it was a demolition and a reconstruction. The Domesday Book is the blueprint of that new structure. It captures the moment when the English became the tenants in their own land, ruled by a foreign elite who brought with them a new language, a new architecture, and a ruthless efficiency that forged the England of the Middle Ages. The death of William the Conqueror in 1087 marks the conclusion of the violent opening chapter of Norman England. He left behind a kingdom that bore little resemblance to the one Edward the Confessor had left vacant 20 years earlier. The transformation was absolute, affecting every aspect of life from the layout of the villages to the language spoken in the court. The most profound shift was geopolitical. For centuries prior to the conquest, England had looked north. Its culture, trade, and politics were inextricably linked to Scandinavia. The North Sea was a highway that connected York to Oslo and Copenhagen. The Norman conquest severed these ties. England was violently pulled into the orbit of Western Europe. For the next 400 years, the history of England would be defined by its relationship with France. The English Channel replaced the North Sea as the primary artery of influence. This shift would ultimately lead to the Angevin Empire and the Hundred Years' War, as English kings who remained French dukes fought for control of the continent. This cultural colonization is most evident in the English language itself. For 3 centuries after Hastings, the kings of England did not speak English. French became the language of power, law, administration, and literature, while English remained the vernacular of the peasantry. Over time, these 2 tongues merged to create the Middle English of Chaucer, and eventually the modern language we speak today. The scars of the conquest remain visible in our vocabulary. The Anglo-Saxon peasants herded the living animals, giving us the Germanic words cow, sheep, and swine. The Norman aristocracy ate the prepared meat, giving us the French words beef, mutton, and pork. The physical landscape of England was similarly revolutionized. The Anglo-Saxons were not great builders in stone, they preferred wood. The Normans, however, were engineers of occupation. They tore down the modest English churches and replaced them with massive Romanesque cathedrals. The cathedrals at Durham, Winchester, and Canterbury were built on a scale that dwarfed anything seen in England since the Romans left. Alongside these houses of God rose the castles of men. The Tower of London and the hundreds of motte and bailey fortifications that littered the countryside served as permanent stone reminders of the new order. They were machines of dominance, ensuring that the Anglo-Saxon resistance could never again threaten the ruling class. In retrospect, the events of 1066 represent a tragic collision of 3 distinct worlds. Harald Hardrada represented the end of the Viking Age, a final attempt to recreate the North Sea Empire of the past. Harold Godwinson represented the apex of Anglo-Saxon England, a sophisticated and wealthy society that was ultimately too isolated to survive the changing tides of European warfare. William of Normandy represented the future, a feudal, armoured and bureaucratic efficiency that would define the High Middle Ages. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was effectively extinct by the time of William's death. Their lands were gone, their positions given to foreign mercenaries, and their culture suppressed. Yet, the synthesis of these 2 peoples, the defeated English and the victorious Normans, would eventually forge a new national identity. The trauma of the conquest created a nation that was neither wholly Germanic nor wholly French, but something entirely unique. The year 1066 stands as the definitive break in English history, the dividing line that separates the ancient world from the modern. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.